There was this fellow, Cree Scots fellow, that an old neighbor of mine who used to make hockey rinks for the kids and ice toboggan runs in the winter. He was a bachelor. He had his own way of doing things, and he'd keep time and curfew in a unique way. And this is a bit of a politically incorrect anecdote given the challenges of gun control and great tragedies, but I have to tell you the story anyhow. So one day these kids were pushing the curfew a little bit late, and they were making a heck of a lot of noise out in front of his house on the toboggan run, and so he opened up his window, stuck his gun out, shot a blank over their heads, and that's when they knew that it was time up. So I trust you'll use a little bit more kosher method to keep me on time. So 40 years ago, members of my home community presented a report on behalf of James Bay Cree Society to Ontario's Royal Commission on the Northern Environment. Entitled Wetamaquin to Inform, it was based on interviews with elders, one of whom, Raphael Wabino, recommended that Native students should be taught Northern cultural values with new values that are introduced from Southern communities, and that a cultural center would help people, both young and old, to learn and exchange ideas on moral and cultural values. I hope to eventually help found such a center in Cree territory, where the best ideas of Cree culture can be brought into deep dialogue with the best ideas of Western and other cultures. I share with others here the conviction that Cree and Indigenous knowledge systems, histories, and cultures are important not only for Indigenous revitalization, but also because they have something unique and profound to say to the wider world about what it means to be human, and how to live well in relation to our human and other than human world. My perspective is rooted in lived experience, starting 4 decades ago as a non-Indigenous person born into a Cree-centered world, into what was for me a middle ground that in many ways fostered two-eyed seeing. Just prior to the 500th anniversary of 1492, historian Richard White published a seminal book entitled The Middle Ground, Indians, Empires, and Republics in the Great Lakes region, 1650 to 1850. In it, he presented a history of 200 years of contact and interaction in this region that was defined neither by European conquest nor Indigenous resistance. Rather, it was marked by a period of sustained balance of power that prompted or forced diverse European and Indigenous groups to construct common meaning out of their misunderstanding and misreading of each other's different cultures. What is most telling is that White was surprised by his own findings and that others found his book groundbreaking. Essentially, few could imagine any history of European and Indigenous intercultural relations that did not entail progressive encroachment by Europeans, slowed only by diminishing Indigenous resistance. While he helped overturn many misperceptions about Indigenous European relations, White nevertheless framed this middle ground primarily as something new constructed from, between, and on top of their cultural differences. There seems to be little scholarship of Indigenous European relations especially that explores in great depth the possibility that cultural middle grounds may entail the discovery and creative re-articulation of profound common ground hidden beneath and within real cultural differences. One reason for this is simply that it requires a tremendous fluency in sometimes profoundly different languages and cultures before one can discern commonalities that lie beneath and within those differences. The more obvious reason, however, is the ongoing intergenerational impact of coercive policies of cultural assimilation in the service of nation and empire building. Linda Tuhiwe-Smith explains that the reach of imperialism into our heads challenges colonized communities to decolonize our minds, to recover ourselves, to claim a space in which to develop a sense of authentic humanity. Post-colonial Indigenous cultural renewal tends to emphasize the differences between pre-contact cultures and the colonialist cultures that have influenced them. In contrast, post-colonial European cultural renewal tends to emphasize non-European cultural difference as a tool of self-critique. Brad Gregory also points to another reason for the emphasis on cultural difference: simultaneous and contradictory claims about the nature of moral and human authenticity. The first seeks to maximize individual autonomy to determine the good according to one's preference. The second endeavors to uphold human rights as a safeguard against the horrific things that human beings can do to one another, and I would add to all life, depending on their preferences. In short, Emphasis on cultural difference, relativism, diversity is not only a means of defending against illegitimate impositions, but also a means of avoiding legitimate sanctions. Who gets to decide the difference, and on what basis? I think the critical questions we face together demand that we explore our different cultures more deeply for the common insights that they reveal beneath and within their differences. And realizing that I have very little time left, I'm just going to give you the example of my own PhD studies in Cree intellectual history, and I call it that very much intentionally. Cree intellectual history in the encounter with European cultures. And in particular, what I did was I looked at how, when pushed to the edge of their humanity, in moments of famine, great hardship, like the kinds of situations that we may face if we don't address the problems that we want to address today. In those situations, they were forced to both try to understand and control the reality of mental and moral failures. And fundamentally, the Wendigo, Huitigo concept is like a photographic negative of some profoundly important values that I think are very relevant to us and that I found are shared beyond indigenous cultures and certainly by the Europeans that encountered them as well. So the Huitigo in many ways represents the loss of epistemic integrity, the incapacity to see things as they are, or the twisting of reality, the intentional misreading of things. You know, you're no longer a human being, you're a moose. You are what I need you to be in order to survive, right? So it's either the loss of the incapacity to see things as they are or the intentional twisting of things, which suggests then that the fundamental value of that culture is truth and epistemic integrity. The second element is the loss or the withdrawal of relationship, or the destruction and manipulation of relationship. The third element is either the loss of self-control or the emphasis on the control and manipulation of others. So, truth, relationship, cultivation of self-control, fundamental values in Cree culture that in my sort of history of the Huitigo concept, the encounters between indigenous peoples and Europeans with the Huitigo and with each other, despite very important cultural differences, despite real conflicts. What I discovered at the end of this was really, hidden actually in those very struggles and in the Huitigo concept itself, a persistent shared conviction that reducing our human and other human world, and our other than human world, to an object of control or self-interest signals mental and moral failure. So it's definitely important to emphasize cultural diversity, but not necessarily for its own sake. We need to go beyond that. We need to dig deeper and to allow ourselves to challenge each other and to be challenged by each other. So I think there's tremendous practical and philosophical wisdom in Raphael Wabeno's recommendation to bring indigenous and non-indigenous cultures into such a dialogue. And I believe that he would be very pleased to see the space for a dialogue of that nature that's been created here 40 years later. Thank you.